นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening or good afternoon, depending where you are. One of the questions that keeps popping up with people particularly new to Buddhism or new to the practice of meditation is they have a problem with understanding what is the goal of Buddhist practice, which you might call Nibbana, but then how do you implement that understanding of the goal in daily life? Because usually for Nibbana we use all kinds of kind of vague words like the unconditioned, the unborn, the undying, non-attachment. Emptiness is probably one of the most common ones, from the word sunyata, and so on. There's a lot of these words which are telling you what Nibbana is not. But the way we are brought up to think is usually we're looking for descriptions of what is rather than what is not. But we can't get that because language is not enough to describe it. It's something you have to actually experience and know for yourself through the practice. And of course we haven't done that practice yet, so we have the doubt and we have the questions. One attribute of Nibbana that Luang Por Chah might use sometimes is non-suffering. And that's probably something that most people can relate to. Nobody wants to suffer. No one likes suffering. So when we talk about non-suffering, it sounds good, attractive. So we are practicing for non-suffering. Then Ajahn Chah would say, well, where does suffering come from? It comes from attachment, or clinging. So where you're suffering in life, there must be some attachment or clinging behind it, lying behind it. And where there's attachment, there must be delusion. So he would encourage us to notice that as you go through your life, where suffering starts to arise in your experience, or start looking, if you're interested to overcome it, end it, then go back and look, well, where must I be clinging? And this process of investigation and looking back helps you to gain some knowledge, some understanding, which will help to remove some of that delusion which feeds the attachment. Another contemporary of Ajahn Chah's, Luang Ta Mahabua, used to say, yeah, this is a problem. People have this, hear the word emptiness, the unconditioned for Nibbana, and they struggle to understand what that means, because in daily life to just walk around and say, my aim in life is to experience emptiness, it's difficult, as a concept. Especially in the English language, emptiness is often seen as a kind of a negative thing. My life is empty, means without meaning, without purpose. But in Buddhism we use it for Nibbana. But still, if your starting point is you're just an ordinary human being who's noticed, I've got some stress, some suffering in my life, what can I do about it? And you're looking for answers from Buddhism. And then you say, well, I'm here to practice emptiness or experience emptiness. Seems like a big leap, maybe, from where you are now to knowing or penetrating emptiness. So Ajahn Mahabua used to say, well, this emptiness, what it means is emptiness of attachment, emptiness of an attachment to a self. The idea of a self, which is where all our suffering is really sort of reinforced and where it comes from. It's the idea of a self, me, that takes ownership of this body, this mind, our thoughts and feelings. And that's why we say emptiness, because when you see through the delusion of self to experience emptiness, well, the idea is suffering drops away. But then in daily life, we need the idea of self as well. It's a useful idea. That's why human beings talk about themselves and other people and how we feel and what we think. You know, that's just common sense. We talk in that way, as if there is a self. What we would call the conventional idea of a self. It's useful. So Ajahn Mahabua would say, well, on the ordinary level, there is a self, of course, and we can use that. But on the deeper level that you access or become aware of through meditation, there is no self. But that's something you're investigating. But in the beginning, maybe, you're not fully ready to investigate not self or experience not self. And some people do have very quick insight into it. But also most of us need to just, you might say, calm down a bit before we can start investigating something as subtle as emptiness or not self. And that calming down process means maybe still using the idea of a self and developing some of the skills and good qualities that the Buddha was pointing to help this self that we're still identifying with to relax, calm down, be more at ease. So then you can maybe ask these more deeper, profound questions about, well, what is the self? You know, if you're too agitated and too stressed about things, your suffering is so intense, you can't really calm down, then there's not much chance you're going to be able to understand emptiness or experience emptiness, realize emptiness. First of all, you just have to get enough food to eat and stop getting angry with your neighbor or whatever. Stop fighting and stop competing on the more coarse, ordinary level. Because that's, unfortunately, a lot of our experience in the world is like that, isn't it? We spend a lot of time getting stressed about work and money and health and living with other people, whether it's family or working with other people, the more ordinary things of life. We have to develop some peace in the midst of that before we can maybe question more deeply, well, what is the point of it all and what is this self? So sometimes we say you have to develop the good self before you can let go of self altogether or experience and know emptiness. You'll see a lot of the Buddhist teachings are helping you with that, how to live in the world in a way where you're not creating a lot of stress and suffering for yourself, still using the idea of self, or other people. Because if you're doing too much of that, it's just impossible for your mind to settle down and go more deeper into meditation or really get answers to these questions. So a lot of the Buddhist teachings are encouraging us to practice generosity, kindness, forgiveness, morality, just learning to be mindful of our actions, our speech, so that we're not hurting others or hurting ourselves. Learning to develop a sense of self-respect, so still using the idea of a self, respect for others, using an idea of other selves in our speech and our behavior. A lot of the Buddhist teachings are taken up with these very ordinary matters, because we still have to learn how to do that. Even if we say we know already, most people can understand or remember oh yeah, I have to stop hurting the guy next to me or arguing with the people I live with or whatever. You know, we understand that, but actually we often are not yet practicing it. So when we're meditating or come to meditate, a lot of our effort is actually just learning to calm the mind down. Put into, you know, letting go of self-aversion, lack of self-respect, aversion for others, confusion, worries, fears, all the kind of normal stuff we talk about. Much of our meditation is taken up with that, dealing with still on this level of a self, one who has a lot of negative emotions, thoughts, worries, memories, some memories unpleasant, and then lots of expectations and hopes and all kinds of desires for the future. That's a large part of our meditation practice, I think, if we're honest. So the Buddha gave us lots of teachings about that, how to settle down in life, how to calm down, how to relax enough so that you can go a bit more deeper into your mind and ask these questions on a deeper level. What is the self? What is emptiness? What was the Buddha talking about when he referred to Nibbana? So it's something you have to learn, I think, over time. As you practice more, you kind of get used to switching between you might say, these two levels. You know, learning just to relax, calm down, let go of the more normal kinds of stress and worries and doubts and stuff, often what we call the mental hindrances as you meditate. And then moving, when the mind is a little bit more still, more mindful, whether it's when you're on retreat or you're just having what we call a good meditation, where your mind is, the mindfulness is more continuous and the mind becomes a bit more still and stable. Then moving into this mode where you're questioning or investigating things more. Now you can investigate what is self, how does self manifest, is self real, is it true, anytime. But it tends to be more on a kind of superficial level if your mind is not yet very peaceful or still. You know, if we're honest, it's more just speculating, philosophizing, theorizing. And to some extent that's okay. But if you really want to experience the peaceful mind that leads to Nibbana that the Buddha was talking about, we also have to set aside all of that and just bring the mind to what we call one-pointedness or samadhi, stillness. And we also have to live in a way that will support that. And that again is something that often people are not yet really ready for. And that involves a certain amount of renunciation, letting go on the outside, not just letting go on the inside. That's really asking too much of yourself. You know, if your life is very complex, busy, or you don't have a lot of personal discipline or awareness in your daily life, what you're saying, what you're doing, well, when you come to meditate, it's unlikely you're going to experience deep states of stillness. Not impossible, but unlikely, because there's just too much going on. So we also have to live in a way that supports deepening our practice of mindfulness, developing states of samadhi. So the Buddha encouraged us to keep precepts, 5 precepts at least, and 8 precepts also to help bring up this sense of renunciation, letting go. Because it's very easy to spend our whole lives just chasing material happiness, sensory stimulation, new experiences, new pleasures, new things, over and over again, and the world supports that. We've got plenty of places we can travel to, plenty of technology to give us all kinds of information and new stimulus. There's plenty of data in the world to surf. So we actually have to practice some renunciation, what we call nekama barami. Especially if you want to really still your mind, you have to learn how to just be willing to set things aside. Even things that can be quite pleasant on one level, sometimes you have to forgo pleasures of the more material or sensual nature in order to develop some inner peace and happiness of a more refined and subtle level. So if you really want to develop an understanding, say, of emptiness, move your mind towards Nibbana, there has to be a fair amount of renunciation. Even the word brings a lot of fear to people because we don't like to give up. It sounds like a bad thing. Why do I have to give up my pleasures? Either we have fear, or sometimes we have guilt. Oh, my guilty pleasures, I like to indulge in this, I like to indulge in that. The idea of renunciation usually brings with it certain reactions. So we really have to think about it. Why would the Buddha teach this? And what's the value of it? And how to practice it wisely as well. And the Buddha himself, you might say, he went to an extreme before he became enlightened and before he understood what Nibbana was and emptiness is. He went to the extreme of really pushing himself, renouncing the world, renouncing all kinds of comfort, renouncing food and sleep and physical pleasure to an extreme. But then ultimately he said, maybe that's going too far. Didn't make his mind settle down, didn't bring him any wisdom, or not much wisdom. So he gave that up. So he wasn't pushing us to just, give up all comfort, give up all food and all comfort in the world and just become an extreme ascetic. He taught what we call the middle way, so learning not to just seek sensual indulgence for the sake of it, in a more habitual or automatic way, or in a way where you're just not aware of what you're doing, addictive or obsessive maybe. But he didn't say just renounce everything to the point where you're just pushing yourself to literally hurting yourself, physically harming yourself or damaging your health or making yourself miserable. He said practice the middle way. So partly that's attitude, isn't it? Getting the attitude right, that seeing that pursuing sensual pleasure, material happiness as a goal is not going to bring you clarity and understanding. But rejection of it and pushing yourself to the point of pain is also not going to bring you the understanding. He taught the middle way, where you're practicing in a way where you're not indulging to the point that it blocks your mind or feeds delusion and stops your mind from becoming still, quiet, peaceful. That's something we have to learn. We have to learn how our lifestyle can support deepening the practice of meditation, developing mindfulness, developing states of calm. What is the right amount? Right amount of food, right amount of sleep, the right amount of different activities, using sila and mindfulness to help understand what is that right amount, right level. And then practicing meditation, and then you refine some of that understanding. So as you practice more mindfulness and develop more samadhi, you also learn, what does support that in your daily life? How much to eat, how much to sleep, how much to socialize and engage with the world, how much time to spend on your computer and all that kind of stuff. You learn that as you meditate, and you learn more and more. Ideally, you become wiser in understanding what lifestyle supports your practice of meditation and developing states of samadhi. You learn, obvious things like, if you drink or take drugs, it's very difficult to calm your mind down in meditation. If you're aggressive with other people through your speech, your actions, it's very hard to calm your mind down. You learn this kind of thing. So you steer away from those kinds of behavior. What the world might say is you become more boring. But if you're gaining something internally, you're becoming more peaceful and gaining more insight and understanding, maybe that's enough to support you and to help you shrug off the claims that you've become boring. Because you're becoming more peaceful. Ideally, you could say more happy, but more happy in the way of Dhamma, not more happy as in more sensual experience, going back to the way of the world, but more happy in the sense of less suffering. That's your aim in the practice. And if your lifestyle is supporting that, and then the practice of mindfulness and meditation is supporting that, well, that's good, isn't it? So this is all what you might call developing the good self, still using the concept, the idea of a self, thinking about your life, your lifestyle, and how you do things, and the people you associate with. What did the Buddha say? Is that associate with fellow Dhamma practitioners, Kalyana Mitta, people who have sila, ideally people who meditate and appreciate the value of that. Choosing who you associate with, thinking about how you spend your time, what activities you pursue. All of this, you could say, is done with the idea of a self. I am one practicing the Dhamma, and I think about who I spend my time with and how I spend my time and what I do and how I earn my living and how I relate to other people. It's always with a sense of I, me, relating to other people, so with a sense of self. But that's not the end of the story there. It's just understanding you're using the concept, the idea of self, on the ordinary level, the conventional level, trying to live your life in a skillful way, learning how to do that to support deeper states of stillness and meditation. And not necessarily becoming a monk or a nun, although that's one solution, because that quickly brings up the sense of renunciation and letting go. But it could be living as a layperson, but also devoting yourself very much to the practice of meditation and mental training, and using the idea of self and developing the good self, or the self that is sort of content, happy, to get to the point where your mindfulness is strong enough and continuous enough, you can experience some real stillness of mind in meditation. When I say stillness of mind, I mean when the mindfulness is more continuous, such as when you're using a meditation object, letting go of the 5 hindrances and getting to the point where maybe your mind is just knowing, but without creating a self around experience, which is different from normal. You're no longer thinking about things from this point of view of me, myself, a person, a being, other people, themselves. Now it's just knowing in a very pure and a very peaceful way, knowing without adding on. And this is the purpose of samadhi, is it gives you the chance to look back at your experience of this body and mind, but without adding on anything, and to ask questions in a very peaceful way. You might say to investigate or develop insight. You can use all these words in different ways, but what it really means is asking questions about this delusion of self, or to see through the delusion of self. And so the traditional way, the Buddha said, well, ask questions. Is this body a self? Is it something that you can control and own and make do what you want? And when you're peaceful and you ask that question, you probably quite quickly get an answer. No, I don't really own this body. I can, up to a point, I can control it and make it do things, but I can't stop it getting old, and I can't stop it feeling hunger and cold and pain and this and that. I can only control it or own it up to a point. So again, there is a sense of self up to a point, and then you realize ultimately, no, it's not a self. I can't do much with this body, and one day it's got to get old, get sick and die. And you move on to the harder part of the human being, the nama dhammas, aspects of the mind. So consciousness itself, is that a self? The mind, that which knows. Is there a self in that? Is the self in the feelings, the memories, the thoughts, the seeing, the hearing, the tasting, the touching? Where is the self in this? Where is the me, I, myself in all of this? And to keep asking questions, and obviously to do that you need some mental energy, some mindfulness, and you need some stillness, some quietness. If your mind is endlessly chattering and getting caught up into all kinds of negative emotions, it's difficult to do that. This is why we have this way of practice, developing the peaceful self, sila, samadhi, letting go of the coarser mental states, and then insight and wisdom through asking questions and investigating, until maybe you can get to a point where the sense of self really seems to disappear. Whether you're looking at the body or the mind, can't find the self anywhere. Maybe then you start to get in touch with this idea of emptiness, sunyata, or the unconditioned, the unborn, the undying, and get an idea that what we call a self is really a collection of different component parts, different moments of consciousness, sometimes happy, sometimes sad, different mental states, sometimes feel good, sometimes feel bad, different memories that come up but then are always changing as well, coming up, passing away again. Different sensations, everything we can feel and know about this body. The more we observe with the peaceful mind, the more it seems that this, what we call a self, is really a collection of component parts, arising and ceasing, always changing, always influencing, one thing influencing another, but never really under our absolute control. This is what the Buddha said in asking these questions from a peaceful mind. This is what it will reveal to you. It's like, this idea of a self that I've taken for granted for so long is not actually what I thought it was. So it can be a bit disconcerting at first, surprising, shocking, different for sure. But also the aim is that by seeing the truth more and more from this place of stillness and quietness, your mind is liberated from delusion. When you liberate it from delusion, you're liberating it from clinging and attachment, and you're liberating it from suffering. If there's no self and you know that and you see that, then there's no one to suffer. Even if you experience some pain, there's no one taking ownership of the pain, and the pain doesn't take ownership of anyone, because it's just pain, it's just a feeling. Mental pain, physical pain, it's just a feeling. Memory is just memory, thoughts are just thoughts, body is just the body. What changes is this sense of ownership through investigating and asking questions, particularly from a peaceful mind. This sense of self is kind of investigated to the point where it disappears because there's nothing there. There is no permanent self sort of existing all by itself. That's a delusion, and that's what this practice of meditation starts to reveal. So yes, it can be confusing, the idea of Nibbana being anatta, not self, the unconditioned, the unborn, the undying, the unattached, non-attached, emptiness. And you can't necessarily understand that just like that. It's something you have to maybe just put on one side to start with, and then go back to what you can understand. And what did the Buddha say? He said, well, before you can really penetrate emptiness, you have to settle down, calm down in your life. And that will mean sometimes making changes to the way you do things, the way you live, the way you go about your life, go about your business, the way you relate to yourself, the way you relate to other people, so that you can bring yourself to a point where you at least have some sense of peace and well-being, enough to develop deeper states of samadhi through meditation. And then you can do this process of questioning and maybe get some real insight from that. So yes, Buddhism can be a little confusing at times, but maybe that's just because we're not ready for all the concepts and the teachings yet. Maybe give it a chance, practice a bit more, and maybe over time, that was my experience, over time, things start to reveal themselves to you. But you have to give it time, be patient, put the effort in, practice, and little by little, some of these ideas or concepts actually become things that you can know, rather than just believe in or doubt or not believe. We often don't. You hear people say that as well. You know, I don't believe in emptiness, or various things that the Buddha said. In the end, you have to come to an understanding through your practice. It's not just to be believed in or disbelieved, something to be known through the practice. Anyway, maybe I'll leave you with those reflections here, and if anyone has any questions after this, we'll endeavour to answer them for you.